Good morning, everyone. I'm Charles Payne in for Maria Bartiromo. Joining us straight ahead on Sunday Morning Futures, Texas Republican Congressman Louis Gohmert reacts to the partial government shutdown now in its second week. This as Democrats prepare to take control of the House on Thursday. What will it take to break a very bitter stalemate? Plus, former Justice Department prosecutor James Trusty weighing in on the legal battle over immigration. Democrats outraged after the death of 2 migrant children in U.S. custody, while President Trump points to the murder of a California police officer, allegedly by an undocumented migrant, to push for that border wall. And former State Department Senior Advisor Christian Whiten will join us to discuss the withdrawal of U.S. troops in Syria, the president vowing to fulfill his campaign promise by pulling troops out of the region. But how does this affect the containment policy toward Iran? All this and more as we look ahead on Sunday Morning Futures. We begin with the White House blaming Democrats for this partial government shutdown. The standoff over the wall funding is expected now to stretch into the new year, presenting a day-one challenge for the next Speaker of the House, presumably Nancy Pelosi. Here now to talk about it, Republican Congressman from Texas, Louis Gohmert, who's a member of the House Freedom Caucus and the House Judiciary Committee, where he's the vice chairman on the subcommittee on crime, terrorism, and homeland security. Representative Gohmert, thanks for joining us. It feels we've come a long way. We're a week into this, and I'm not sure that the American public necessarily feels an impact, but the political pressure seems to be mounting day by day. Play out the possibilities of how this may end.
Well, it's going to end at some point because there are things that have not been funded that the Democrats desperately want to fund, be it HUD and some other things. But the truth is, there is nothing more important than the nation's security. It's our #1 job in the U.S. Congress, keeping America safe. And when you have people that are here legally from Mexico, from Central America, saying, get the wall where we need it, secure the border, you've got to make this country safe. I don't know why they're not being listened to. And when you hear Democrats saying, oh no, it's immoral to have a wall, and they say that while they're living behind a wall around their houses, like President Obama, I read his new home has a 10-foot wall around it. Walls matter. They do make a difference. And this isn't like the Iron Curtain that kept people in to deal with what Natan Sharansky called a fear society. If we're going to have a free society, it's got to be protected. And Randy Weber said that he saw a bumper sticker in Houston that said, heaven has walls, pearly gates, and a strict immigration policy. Hell has no borders, no walls, and no immigration policy. There's something to that, Charles, and it is a priority. But let me jump in for a second, though. Let me just jump in for a second, though, because I think that the Democrats, again, playing the game of politics, understand what you're saying. I mean, I think if they don't have a wall, they certainly lock their doors at night. So they've tried to sort of make it a game of semantics. Okay, maybe not a wall, but quote unquote security. I think that means drones and other things like that. I mean, is that a viable alternative in your mind? Well, Janet Napolitano spoke for the Democratic Party while she was Secretary of Homeland Security. We had appropriated billions of dollars, much of which was supposed to be a virtual wall, the drones, all of this security cameras and all that. And she ended up ruling that that was not a legitimate use of the money, and she nullified what we appropriated money to do. Now, there was escape provision in case she felt like it was better spent elsewhere, but the fact is she declared that was not a proper use of the money. So this is total hypocrisy for Democrats to come along now after they squandered that money, we haven't been able to find out where, and say, oh no, this would be where we put it. No, we've played that game before, and when you got you the money, you didn't use it for that. We have got to have a tangible wall where we need it. And as Secretary Nielsen has pointed out, when we have a wall, over 95% of the illegal immigration in that area stops. That is important. But when we look at whether this thing is the shutdown, how long before it ends, you look at each party's priority, And I love Justice Scalia. I was having lunch with him one day, and he said, and I don't remember who the Attorney General was, but when he worked for him, he came in one day and he said, hey, I heard a great definition for the difference between Democrats and Republicans. He said, Democrats want to control everything and everybody, and Republicans don't want them to. Now, when you're plotting a strategy like that, it's more of a defense than anything to another party that wants to control people's lives, think they're not smart enough. So we got our work cut out for us, but it's more defensive from here.
Is there a chance of for perhaps a grander compromise? You know, a week or so ago, there was talk of maybe the Republicans coming down a little bit, the White House coming down from its $5 billion number, and the Democrats going up. But what about a grander compromise? Maybe the reintroduction of DACA, the offer that President Trump, I thought was an amazing offer, amazingly generous with respect to what he campaigned on, coming back with something for greater funding for the wall, greater funding for DACA, maybe some immigration policy adjustments because we saw the tragic death of police officer Singh in California. Could this be a chance to take it in a different direction and finally to deliver to the American people honest solutions so that we don't have to deal with this anymore?
Yeah, well, we're going to have to keep dealing with it until we do have the border secure. Any offer of amnesty before the border is secure, our border patrolmen make clear day after day. You guys talk about even legality, amnesty, anything of that nature, Charles. It is a shiny object. It's an attraction that draws thousands and thousands more every day. And so we need to secure the border, and then we can work these things out. But like you said, the president went over backwards to try to negotiate, and he was slapped back for it. And I do think this president is and will prove himself to be the best negotiator we've had, at least in my lifetime. And it helps if people think he's a little bit crazy. You get better deals that way. But he made that offer.
Right.
But I'm telling you, in states like Texas, if you do an amnesty before the border's secure, you can say goodbye to Republicans winning elections in those states ever again.
Okay,
and there
we've
goes
got less
the
than a minute to go, so I do want to ask.
It's serious, deadly serious.
I do want to ask you, Representative Gomer, do you believe then ultimately the Democrats will cave and they will come through with some additional funding where they are right now for this border wall?
Well, with Nancy Pelosi expected to be Speaker, and she's in Hawaii. Most of us have been on alert, ready to run back to Washington at a moment's notice. But as long as she's in Chicago, Hawaii, the odds are zero. Once she gets back, then I'm hoping that some grander scheme can be worked out, a compromise worked out. You can compromise on numbers. That's something that's compromisable. But when you are asked to compromise on principles that include the security of the country, more precious officers being killed, more children being lured into their deaths. I mean, that's something we really need to stand up for, those lives that are being lost, both legal Americans here and illegal Americans being attracted into their death. It's time to protect this attractive nuisance, is what's called in legal realm like a swimming pool. If a child comes in, falls in your pool and dies from drowning, every state has laws that said that landowner is going to likely be held accountable. Right. And so the Democrats need to understand this is on them.
Yeah, it's we've had 3 tragedies in the last week that all point to
the
desperate need to finally find a solution for this. And of course, it won't be the last for sure. Thank you very much, sir. Always appreciate it. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. See you soon.
Charles, love talking to you. Thank you.
And new concerns on Capitol Hill about the mounting legal issues surrounding our immigration policies. As Democrats demand an explanation into the deaths of 2 migrant children at the border, is Congress prepared to take action in 2019? Stay ahead. We take a look ahead this on Sunday Morning Futures. So as the president squabbles with Democrats over funding for his proposed border wall, legal issues regarding illegal border crossings are rising. Senate Democrats are calling for a hearing into the deaths of 2 Guatemalan children who died while in custody of Customs and Border Patrol protection. This as President Trump cites the killing of a California police officer allegedly by an undocumented immigrant to further push for border wall funding. Let's bring in former Justice Department Prosecutor James Trusty. He's also a partner at IFRA Law. James, obviously a lot of tragedy surrounding this issue and the mounting legal issues that also are beginning to reverberate. Explain to the audience where we are from a legal standpoint as Congress hopefully can cut a deal with President Trump.
Well, Congress is talking about having some enhanced scrutiny of Border Patrol to emphasize, their look at the death of these two children. I don't have a problem with that concept. I also don't leap to the conclusion that Border Patrol is just heartlessly standing by and letting children die. So I suspect that there's at least room for some sort of lawmaking, some sort of compromise where people get together and speak rationally, not just emotionally or on anecdotes, and say, what can we do to fix this entire system? There's a lot of stuff that's broken. But if there are small standard operating procedures that can be tinkered with to allow for the better safety of people in caravans, then I think Border Patrol would probably welcome that, as long as it doesn't affect their safety. So small things can be done, but big things need to be done about asylum, about the processing time, about the resources that go in, all at the same time trying to protect the safety of American citizens and American Border Patrol.
Some are saying that the checklist, perhaps, on determining the health of asylum seekers or anyone else who's caught at the border, maybe there needs to be some adjustments, particularly as it pertains to children. I mean, again, if you give a child a check, if you say, okay, the children are in pretty good health, and then not too long thereafter they pass away, that's going to heighten the sort of anxiety out there, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's a difficult situation. I mean, part of it, again, is just resource driven. You've got, giant hordes of people coming across. You have cultural and language barriers, and then you have folks that might have been healthy at the beginning of their journey that are coming to the U.S. after weeks or months of travel. So there's a lot of operational difficulties that make this a challenge. I know at least in one of the two children's cases, there was hospitalization and clearance. And so even the best doctors sometimes are not going to see just how severe the problem is. But again, if there's ways to tinker with the checklist to make things a little bit safer, I think everyone reasonably should welcome that.
James, in your mind, of all the things, because you mentioned a myriad of issues or problems that must be addressed, what's the number one with a sense of urgency that we should be tackling right now?
Well, let me put it to you this way. If you've been to an airport and you travel internationally and you get in line to come back home, and you may sit in line for an hour, you're filling out forms, you're showing your identification multiple times, and nothing would be more aggravating than doing all of that and then watching a lane open up where 500 people just blow past you without any identification. So we need to find a way to make lawful immigration smoother, more efficient, have the resources devoted to it to make it happen, while shutting back on kind of the unfair line jumping of being an illegal immigrant. No matter how sympathetic the basis may be, no matter how tragic the might be in compared to the other folks that are trying to do everything right to get into the country.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that I think more recently in America, maybe it's the fault of the media, but there's been a lot of conflating on what are legitimate reasons to come here seeking asylum versus just leaving a country because there are no economic opportunities.
Yeah, let me just say, if I lived in El Salvador with my three daughters, I bet you dollars to donuts I'd be trying to get up here too. And it's got a very high murder rate, one of the highest murder rates in the Western Hemisphere, if not the highest. It has economic problems. It has gang problems. And so when you really kind of play the percentages as a parent, it makes sense to try to get to the U.S. But at least originally, the idea of asylum was based on persecution by the government. That's been stretched to include things like domestic violence or gang violence. And that's where it's tough, because there's a lot of very sympathetic stories along with the unsympathetic stories that come from illegal immigration.
Yeah, well, there's some people who live in America who may want to be able to flee their own neighborhoods because of those definitions and seek perhaps some better opportunities. But so this issue has been around for a long time. It's getting worse, not better, because of the vantage point, see where there's an opportunity at this very moment, maybe to get some real concrete solutions in place.
Well, there's an opportunity. It really comes down to the good faith of politicians, and I don't want to put a whole lot of money on that bet. What I'm concerned about is that when you have congressional hearings that either focus on the horrific tragedy of Corporal Singh or on the tragedy of the two children, that it becomes kind of Spartacus moments for politicians where they want to stand up and show posters and announce how compassionate they are compared to everyone else. I'd rather see some sort of joint group come together with law enforcement participation and figure out what are the most pressing problems with asylum, with illegal alien crossing. And again, the big picture, human trafficking and human smuggling is killing an awful lot of people. And that's something that deserves a lot more focus than it gets. People in trucks in the boiling sun or being left in the desert by coyotes. I mean, there's a lot of room for focus there that we haven't had.
James Trusty, thank you very much. Always appreciate it. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Charles.
A new report raising questions about whether former Trump attorney Michael Cohen's alleged contacts with Russian officials during 2016. Really, the question now is, what does this all mean for the Mueller investigation as it moves forward? All this as we look ahead on Sunday Morning Futures. Well, there's some new developments in Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. A recent report is raising questions about President Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen. McClatchy reporting that Cohen's cell phone was detected near Prague in the summer of 2016, supporting claims that Cohen met secretly with Russian officials there. Cohen tweeted a denial hours after the story was published, saying, quote, "I hear Prague, Czech Republic is beautiful in the summertime. I wouldn't know, as I have never been. Mueller knows everything." We're back now with former DOJ prosecutor James Trusty. James, you were so good we had to bring you back.
How you been, Charles?
What do you make of this? This saga, particularly as it pertains to Michael Cohen, you know, no one knows what to believe anymore. I doubt very many Americans believe much with respect to Cohen, but how does this change maybe the dynamics of the Mueller investigation?
Well, I'll tell you, you're putting your finger right on the problem, which is Mr. Cohen. Everything about Mr. Cohen from that sentencing memo that was filed in Manhattan the other day screams liar. So he's not a particularly reliable source for anything. I think it's interesting that he did not get credit under a 5K motion, which is the typical vehicle for giving him credit for cooperation. They said he had not come clean on all of his own dirt. And so you have to wonder a little bit, is this part of that equation? Is there something where they felt very confident that he was attached to that phone near Prague and that they therefore didn't give him the full credit for cooperation? But the bottom line is I'm a big fan of admissible evidence, not just conjecture, not just anonymous sources citing foreign intelligence authorities for some small proposition. So, you know, I think the issue is going to be how much of this actually sees daylight either in a courtroom, which I'm kind of doubting, or in some sort of report. And that's what I think the White House has to be fearful of, which is a report that doesn't really go through the process of making evidence admissible or reliable or even determining credibility, but just throws out every bit of fact from every bit of source they can find in a pretty compelling and bad narrative.
Is that your assessment from the outside looking into what we're at least hearing and getting from the Mueller investigation so far?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm as far outside as everyone. I mean, we're kind of guessing from what we see procedurally. But you do see the sentencings taking place for various people that cooperated or partially cooperated. That tends to show that this investigation is winding down. You're starting to hear bits and pieces of litigation from the grand jury side making daylight too. But I think we're heading towards an end game, and I think there's a good chance that it's not going to be something where the president's indicted. He was a subject after all, but where there could be a report that could be used for political purposes that's pretty damning depending on how they write it.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned the sentencing memo. The Southern District had 36 pages of scathing, I mean, just scathing. Their animosity towards Michael Cohen was you know, they wore right on their sleeves. They were pretty upset, to your point, that he didn't cooperate, that he lied. Whereas Mueller felt like maybe there was a different interpretation. And again, that led to the media jumping more on the Mueller interpretation of whether or not Michael Cohen was trustworthy and honest and really had cooperated with respect to the Southern District, which seemed pretty clear that this guy, throw the book at him because he's a liar and he doesn't serve anyone well.
Well, it's interesting. The Southern District said he's a liar, he's a terrible human being with all these things he's done, of either being dishonest or being a bully, being a bagman. But then they did kind of grudgingly say he should probably get a little bit of credit for cooperation. They invited the judge to go a little below the 42-month guideline. So I'm not sure that the two sides are all that far apart. The Mueller case was a much smaller potato case in terms of what the exposure was for Mr. Cohen, so they were kind of necessarily in a backseat to Manhattan. But I think it's interesting. I'm not sure they were that far apart. I just think that the Southern District memo did not warm up to the memo that Mr. Cohen's attorneys had filed.
It's interesting you say for Mueller it was smaller potatoes, because you would not get that interpretation from reading a newspaper, from reading a headline, from watching the media. This is President Trump's personal attorney. He knew everything. This is the end. I mean, the scathing, dramatic headlines in the panels. 50 people on a panel, every one of them throwing daggers. This is the end. You certainly wouldn't have got that interpretation from the way the media looked at this whole thing.
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of hysteria. I think I heard Greg Gutfeld say the other night that everything with Trump is measured in dog years, where he packed 7 years of activity into 1 year. And that's kind of how it feels on the news cycle. There's so much coming out. There's so much emotionality to it that people kind of lose track of actually looking at it analytically or legally. And I think if you do that, you can kind of step back and realize that Trump was a subject. He's probably not going to get indicted. There may be people close to him that are. There may be a report that's very damning, but we have to wait and see. This is a probe that hasn't been leaking its business, so we have to be a little bit more patient than we tend to be in this kind of world.
It hasn't been leaking, but it's gone on for a couple of years, and what we have seen does not point to collusion. And you have to say to yourself again, getting back to Washington, D.C. and the idea, do you go after President Trump on potential campaign finance violations where other presidents, including President Obama, simply paid a fine? It seems like a tall order right now. James, I'll give you the last word.
No, look, that's a good point, and that raises another question, which is Southern District of New York. When they talked about Cohen, they made it clear that they viewed the president, at least in their filing, as having some potential culpability as well. But these are not easy areas of law for prosecutors to establish the willful intent when it comes to campaign finance fraud. So there's a lot that's on the table for prosecutors to sift through. I'm not convinced that the president's going to get indicted, but that doesn't mean it's a good day for him as these probes wind up. So we'll have to wait and see.
All right, James Trusty, again, thank you very much. I'll see you soon.
Sure, good seeing you.
And more than a week after President Trump announced that he would withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, lawmakers are still concerned about the consequences it may have in the Middle East. We're going to examine those potential consequences and impact in the region. We look ahead on Sunday Morning Futures. Concerns are mounting over President Trump's decision to withdraw American troops from Syria. U.S. presence in that war-torn country has served as an obstacle to Iran's President Hassan Rouhani, who has been the focus on his country's, he's been focusing really, we know, on expanding influence throughout the region, particularly.
A silver lining, if you will, to Assad gaining control of more and more land, bringing an end to a war that has killed more than 300,000 people. You know, our objective was never to take down Assad. Obama said he must go, but then never did anything about it, and that was never our choice to make. If we could turn Syria into Beverly Hills, if we could sever Iran's land connection with Lebanon, make it harder for them to supply Hezbollah, that would be good. That would help Israel. But those are really hard things to do. They would require a much larger, more massive war. And Israel is actually able to manage its defense by striking in Syria as necessary when very urgent threats arise.
But there are reports that Erdogan may be building forces right on the edge of Kurdish territory, and that's going to put us in a predicament if he makes a move on them.
You know, yes, but the fact is, you know, of all of the parts, of all of the neoconservative objectives that have sprung up recently in Syria, the United States' support for an independent Kurdish state in Syria is one that has never been, to my knowledge, run by the president, never certainly run by Capitol Hill. I don't know of a single hearing. You know, we created a Kurdish state de facto in northern Iraq. To create another one in Syria, that will very much irritate our Turkish allies, who are also fair weather friends. But nonetheless allies. This is just a complication. This is something we never signed up for. I'm sorry if some generals made promises to the Kurd that they didn't have the authority to offer, but these people, I believe, will find a political solution, perhaps in league with Assad. It's not our job to create another Kurdistan in Syria. You
know, you mentioned the neoconservatives or the neocons, and it really, to me, with the resignation of General Mattis, it felt like, you know, they thought that was their moment to reassert that we should have, troops in Afghanistan, troops in Syria, that we should have people in harm's way. And I'm going to get a little personal here, but today would have been my father's 75th birthday, Christian. When he came back from the Vietnam War, he was never the same human being, and he wouldn't have died perhaps 20 years too soon if it hadn't been for that. Are they considering that the American public may not want to have our best young men and women in Syria, or thousands and thousands of troops in the war in Afghanistan, and obviously we won't win? I mean, do they consider the human ramifications at all?
I don't think so. That, you know, and if you look at their willingness to send other people's children into war, you know, the mortality that killed in action numbers are not as big as they were in previous wars. But for every one person killed, obviously that is a huge cost. There are 10 other people perhaps maimed for life. And then there are the psychological scars. We lose 20 veterans a day to suicide. That's skewed heavily toward younger veterans who fought in these recent wars. Been in Afghanistan 17 years. I don't know what we're going to accomplish in another year or two that we haven't accomplished in 17 years. One, you know, interesting statistics is next year, if we're still there, you may have the case where someone who wasn't even born on 9/11 goes to serve in Afghanistan, and they have a father or mother who served same country, same war. We've been there that long. As for the neoconservatives, they're terrible about politics, both here and abroad. If they were good at politics abroad, they know the best way to fight Iran is politically, by encouraging dissent within that country, not by putting forces in Afghanistan, in Syria. And domestically, they don't understand how horrendously unpopular their policies are. If you poll the American public, should we go up in Afghanistan or down? 2-to-1, people want fewer troops there. About 25% of Americans think we aren't winning, and only 15% think we have a clear strategy in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, we know it's difficult, we know it's tough, and the reality is sometimes not what we want it to be. You clearly pointed that out. Christian, always great to have these conversations with you. We'll see you again real soon. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Charles. Thanks.
Well, it's day 9 of the partial government shutdown as the White House and congressional Democrats are no closer to reaching a new deal. So who gets the blame as hundreds of thousands of federal workers are furloughed or working without pay? That's next as we look ahead on Sunday Morning Futures. President Trump pointing the finger at Democrats as we enter day 9 of the partial government shutdown. The White House accusing lawmakers of abandoning shutdown negotiations pending the arrival of a new Congress this Thursday when Democrats take control of the House. All of this setting up an early challenge for likely Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, who will need to work with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell if she wants to swiftly reopen its government. I want to bring in Ed Rollins, former campaign manager for President Reagan's 1984 campaign, and Alphonse DeMonto, former Republican senator from New York. Gentlemen, thank you both.
Thank you.
Senator, let me start with you. It's an amazing game of chicken going on, and we're watching it in full display here. Both sides have buckled in. Although President Trump, to his credit, did not go on vacation, he stayed in Washington, and it feels like he has been trying to reach out to his colleagues on the other side of the aisle.
Thank God he stayed in Washington. That's the one good thing he's done. I think number two, he's right about border security. But I think he's missed an essential ingredient, and the Republican Party has, the Republican leadership. The biggest problem you have, and I'm for the wall, is catch and release. This is the most absurd program, and most Americans, or many of them, don't really realize what it is. It means that when someone comes over illegally, they're here. Because what happens? They're brought to a detention center, and they are basically released. And many of them.
President Trump has talked about this on several occasions.
On several occasions, but he hasn't explained that what you're doing is encouraging people to come over illegally, and that many of them never return. And that's why you had the recent incident with the police officer who was killed. This guy never should have been here. And when he was caught, he should have been deported. What you say is, come on over illegally and you can stay here, as opposed to getting online, making your application from the country that you're trying to come to. That's the big key. And now the president cannot and should not back down unless he gets sufficient funds for the wall. But we have not handled this well. We have not educated the American public. Most of them have a faint idea about what catch and release is. That's legislation. That doesn't cost any money, and it makes sense.
Well, Americans do understand the allure of sanctuary cities. They do know our immigration system is broken. people are brokenhearted about this police officer who was murdered. And of course, the irony of it, right? You have someone who longed to come to America, waited his turn, got here legally, volunteered for the police department, became a police officer, and was killed by someone who cut the line, was a gangbanger, and, you know, allegedly. So it's scary stuff.
Well, it's very scary stuff, and obviously the vast majority of people don't, no matter what the president has said or anybody else says, don't understand the problems. The amnesty, all they have to do is come across and say, I want amnesty. They give them a ticket. They say, all right, come back to court in 7 months or 8 months or 4 years from now, who knows.
But the Democrats in Washington, D.C. understand this problem. What are they doing why are they being such obstructionists then if they understand the root of this problem?
In both President Bush and President Obama wanted an amnesty program. Both had majorities of their own party and couldn't get it through. And the problem is one side wants the security, as we do, the Republicans. One side wants easier access. The critical thing here is 1 week from today, we'll know what's happening here. 1 week from today, we'll either have a deal on the budget or the president will have vetoed the deal. Certainly the Democrats, under Pelosi's leadership and Mitch McConnell, will have something on his desk by the end of the week. And if he vetoes it, then you got a long, hard battle. And at the end of the day, you got to figure out what the game plan is. This president can't just run for re-election from the get-go. He's got to basically do some governing here to bring back some of the voters that he lost. This was a terrible election for us. 40 votes margin to the Democrats at this point in time. Senate seats we should have picked up. And at the end of the day here, if we don't get some of those women voters back to us, you're not going to ever have a chance of winning re-election.
Well, right now, to the point you both of you are alluding to is that the polling. I think there's a poll out, Reuters, Ipsos, says 47% right now currently blaming President Trump for the shutdown, 33% Dems, congressional Dems. Ironically, only 7% are blaming Republicans in Congress for this. So it seems like de facto battle between President Trump and Nancy Pelosi. Senator D'Amato, I mean, does she govern by the polls, thinking she's winning this from a PR point of view, or can she come through and try to find some solutions? And by the way, can we have a grand bargain? Because it feels like instead of maybe squabbling over the $5 billion, President Trump made a DACA offer that was amazing. I don't know, Ed, if you think that's amnesty or not, but he made an amazing DACA offer. Bring that back, get full funding for the wall, take care of both of these things with one stroke, and move on.
Yeah, you really haven't. DACA is good. He should take it. The American people are in favor of it. It makes sense. But let me tell you, unless you deal with catch and release, the border wall is going to do little because you can't get.
How do we deal with that legislatively?
It's easy. What you say is that if you come to this country illegally, you go back to where you came from.
But there are loopholes. How do we close the loopholes?
You pass legislation to do that.
And you need both parties to do that.
That's right. And if you really instructed the American people as to how you would save, what you would eliminate, this catch and release people. People who turn out to be criminals, people, some of them who are criminals.
But you don't think that could happen?
I was in the White House. I was the White House political director in 1986 when the last one was done. I was very involved in the negotiation. It took us 5 years to get that bill. 5 years. And Ronald Reagan finally said, make it happen. Make it happen. The votes are not there today to make it happen. And the bottom line here, we want security. They want basically more access. And until you have some comprehensive plan here, you're not going to get it.
But this is not going to go on forever. So how we come to a solution?
Well, it's not going to. It's certainly not going to be solved in the next 2 years. My sense is a lot of other things that need to happen. And the only problem with DACA is you create a two-system in which you let the young people in, but the people who brought them in here, their parents, don't get the right of citizenship. So it's a comprehensive thing. You've got to look at both the security side, which Democrats have never basically given up, including '86. They promised security, they promised the end game, and they didn't live up to it.
We all remember that.
So my sense is you're just not going to get it at this point.
Ed is right, and there's one other ingredient, and that is Nancy Pelosi is not going to take on the new Democrats who just come on, many of whom want open borders. And so she's kind of in a dilemma until she becomes the speaker. So I don't see any quick solution to this. And the president's got to have now the ability to stick it out. He can't just turn in.
Right. I got a feeling that he does. Gentlemen, stay with us. By the way, folks, the markets are closing out 2018, one of the wildest rides. Since October, it has been a roller coaster. Both record gains slumps. Will this continue into the new year? That's next as we look ahead on Sunday Morning Futures.
It breaks you.
As this magnificent species edges closer to...
Good morning, everyone. I'm Charles Payne in for Maria Bartiromo. Joining us straight ahead on Sunday Morning Futures, Texas Republican Congressman Louis Gohmert reacts to the partial government shutdown now in its second week. This as Democrats prepare to take control of the House on Thursday. What will it take to break a very bitter stalemate? Plus, former Justice Department prosecutor James Trusty weighing in on the legal battle over immigration. Democrats outraged after the death of 2 migrant children in U.S. custody, while President Trump points to the murder of a California police officer, allegedly by an undocumented migrant, to push for that border wall. And former State Department Senior Advisor Christian Whiten will join us to discuss the withdrawal of U.S. troops in Syria, the president vowing to fulfill his campaign promise by pulling troops out of the region. But how does this affect the containment policy toward Iran? All this and more as we look ahead on Sunday Morning Futures. We begin with the White House blaming Democrats for this partial government shutdown. The standoff over the wall funding is expected now to stretch into the new year, presenting a day one challenge for the next Speaker of the House, presumably Nancy Pelosi. Here now to talk about it, Republican Congressman from Texas, Louis Gohmert, who's a member of the House Freedom Caucus and the House Judiciary Committee, where he's the vice chairman on the subcommittee on crime, terrorism, and homeland security. Representative Gohmert, thanks for joining us. We've come a long way. We're a week into this, and I'm not sure that the American public necessarily feels an impact, but the political pressure seems to be mounting day by day. Play out the possibilities of how this may end.
Well, it's going to end at some point because there are things that have not been funded that the Democrats desperately want to fund, be it HUD and some other things. But the truth is, there is nothing more important than the nation's security. It's our #1 job in the U.S. Congress, keeping America safe. And when you have people that are here legally from Mexico, from Central America, saying, get the wall where we need it, secure the border, you've got to make this country safe. I don't know why they're not being listened to. And when you hear Democrats saying, oh no, it's immoral to have a wall, and they say that while they're living behind a wall around their houses, like President Obama, I read his new home has a 10-foot wall around it. Walls matter. They do make a difference. And this isn't like the Iron Curtain that kept people in to deal with what Natan Sharansky called a fear society. If we're going to have a free society, it's got to be protected. And Randy Weber said that he saw a bumper sticker in Houston that said, heaven has walls, pearly gates, and a strict immigration policy. Hell has no borders, no walls, and no immigration policy. There's something to that, Charles, and it is a priority. But let me jump in for a second, though. Let me just jump in for a second, though, because I think that the Democrats, again, playing the game of politics, understand what you're saying. I mean, I think if they don't have a wall, they certainly lock their doors at night. So they've tried to sort of make it a game of semantics. Okay, maybe not a wall, but quote unquote security. I think that means drones and other things like that. I mean, is that a viable alternative in your mind? Well, Janet Napolitano spoke for the Democratic Party while she was Secretary of Homeland Security. We had appropriated billions of dollars, much of which was supposed to be a virtual wall, the drones, all of this security cameras and all that. And she ended up ruling that that was not a legitimate use of the money, and she nullified what we appropriated money to do. Now, there was escape provision in case she felt like it was better spent elsewhere. But the fact is, she declared that was not a proper use of the money. So this is total hypocrisy for Democrats to come along now after they squandered that money. We haven't been able to find out where, and say, oh, no, this would be where we put it. No, we've played that game before. When you got you the money, you didn't use it for that. We have got to have a tangible wall where we need it. And as Secretary Nielsen has pointed out, when we have a wall, over 95% of the illegal immigration in that area stops. That is important. But when we look at whether this thing is the shutdown, how long before it ends, you look at each party's priority. And I love Justice Scalia. I was having lunch with him one day, and he said, and I don't remember who the Attorney General was, but when he worked for him, he came in one day and he said, hey, I heard a great definition for the difference between Democrats and Republicans. He said, Democrats want to control everything and everybody, and Republicans don't want them to. Now, when you're plotting a strategy like that, it's more of a defense than anything to another party that wants to control people's lives, think they're not smart enough. So we've got our work cut out for us, but it's more defensive from here.
Is there a chance of perhaps a grander